Well, good morning, John. It's great to see you. We're recording this on Wednesday morning, a day following on Trump's inauguration. Did you watch it, John? Did you see many extracts from the inauguration?
I saw extracts. I didn't wake up at 3 a.m. and follow it, but I guess it was a good show, and I think it was 3 shows, wasn't it, from memory? I think he did it 3 times, but no, that's his way of communicating with the population, and I think all politicians should actually learn from it.
Yeah. The interesting thing is one gets a real sense of energy and activity. You know, the point was made very clearly when within the hour he was signing something like 100 executive orders. So Trump's key policies are about re-exporting illegal migrants, introducing tariffs, getting rid of bureaucratic red tape, drill baby drill, and creating a new sense of optimism and possibility, which seems to be reflected in business confidence and consumer confidence being pretty strong in the United States. How do you contrast that with the environment that we have in Australia at the moment?
Well, let's just put it in context. I mean, he's in a bit of a honeymoon period. He's come out of his pre-honeymoon, now he's in honeymoon. And momentum will be fast and then will slow. So that's probably how I read the next 3 to 6 months. So quite a lot of momentum slowing, and then we get to a plateau where negotiations take place, a lot of announcements. In contrast, Australia is reactive. I mean, I just see that we react to everything. We're not proactive. And I think that's where we fall over. We're not alone. I think we also see that in Europe. Australia in particular needs to get on the front foot, define a strategy, have a vision, and start working towards it, and reacting only when we have to react, when outside influences like Trump affect that vision, so we have to adjust. Now, if you don't have a vision, we're not adjusting anything. So I think a lot of the rhetoric in the press doesn't understand we have no vision. And so the concerns which they have regarding tariffs and some of the other policies are grossly overstated. They'd be more significant if we were working towards something and we saw these things upsetting what we're working towards. We don't have that.
It's kind of very unfortunate that whereas the global macro system is almost in a sweet spot with inflation coming down, central banks indicating that they'll be reducing rates, China hitting 5% GDP growth, the United States, I think the IMF has just upgraded its forecast from 2.2% growth in 2025 to 2.7% growth in the United States in 2025. Australia seems to be stuck in a bit of a sluggish period, John, and we've got the election coming up in May. It's usually a period when there's uncertainty and a lack of confidence, a bit of a negative period. So how do you see that unfolding for Australia?
I think it's what you say. It's interesting that you've got a government who has to go to the election and start trying to redefine its policies because they're so unclear at present. And the opposition has to acknowledge that it had a long period in government and it's got to adjust the policies which it had in place over that period, which didn't work. So we're confounded by both sides of Parliament, having a policy vacuum, which hopefully we will get over in the next 3 months and actually get some firm commitments from. There's a lot of scepticism for, I think, in the electorate. They just don't believe what their party tells them. And then when some sensible policy comes into the debate, the other side goes completely negative. We never get consensus, and that's an issue. But get back on America and the upgrades. I think there's growing evidence, and in presentations I'll give in the next 6 weeks to various organisations, and people should look out for those. It's becoming quite apparent that America's productivity has lifted substantially since COVID, and Australia's productivity, and indeed Europe is slightly up, Australia's is down. And the issue of cost of living and real wage growth is being confronted by poor productivity. So we're immigrated a lot of people. The government can rightly claim we've grown our workforce by a significant amount, but they're all going into services. The production is non-existent. So that's why we're falling over on productivity. And now we've got a catch-up wages issue, and we're seeing it right across the country, particularly on the East Coast in state government claims by workers, state workers, and they're astronomical claims in terms of catch-up, because we had inflation rage ahead, and wages did keep up with it. Now we've got the catch-up, and that's going to have an effect on inflation.
Yeah. But John, some of these claims seem extraordinary, and as you rightly point out, we're not doing well on productivity. The US is quite exceptional in that regard. And just referring to the political vacuum, I saw an article the other day in the Australian Financial Review suggesting that Australia might have to import LNG in 2026. This is a clear example of failure of leadership and strategic planning, when I think we're the third largest producer of natural gas in the world, or third largest exporter, and we're being in a position where we might have to import for the eastern states.
Look, the way Australia runs its parliament is not working. Now, I'm not against democracy, but I think we're failing dramatically in terms of significant national policies which have to be coordinated and bipartisan. This constant debate about how we transition the economy, where neither side of parliament can agree, and you get a third party who's just jockeying for votes and influence, it just doesn't work. And we've got to the major parties have got to step up and say, let's work out what we agree on and force out the third party from being an annoyance, so we can get some pathway to the future. Now, your comments are absolutely right. I've been talking about this for years. You couldn't have a better example of poor energy management and to be a major exporter of energy and then run short of it in your own country. It's a laughable situation. Middle East countries, Asian countries, and indeed America must look at us and just think we're a joke. God knows what China thinks of it. It's an appalling situation. And these people who have designed this have to go off and represent Australia in international markets with people who are running their economies much more efficiently, and they must scratch their head and go, who am I talking to here? So we have an appalling track record which has to be rectified. And the way we debate it, rectification doesn't occur. Now, we've got a major discussion regarding nuclear energy. We are, I think we have 37% of the world's resources to firepower nuclear uranium. Yet we can't even get an agreement on that. We're still subjected to laws regarding the export of uranium, which was set 30 years ago in the bygone era. Australia's got to start looking 30 years forward, not 30 years backwards, to define a strategy.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I just see in the BHP quarterly that they're transitioning away from fossil fuel production to copper, for example, which is one of the energy transition metals, and copper becoming increasingly important. What's your general feel for commodity prices over the course of the year, or is it very dependent on what happens in China?
Well, it's dependent on China, but now that America is supercharging, and we've got to remember that America is the largest economy in the world, at least 33% bigger than China. So if America is growing rapidly, and there's infrastructure announcements to come from the Trump administration, so I assume that's going to require commodities and resources and steel making and cement making. It's hard to imagine if that's what his policy is going to be that's not supportive of commodity prices, consistent with China coming in with their stimulation packages. So you've got effectively, was it 45% of the world GDP supporting their economic growth with infrastructure developments and support from a government expenditure targeted. How's that not positive for resources? And you've got the third world continuing to grow at a rapid rate here. So I'm mildly positive. Yes, I do see supply issues, but I think they're greatly overstated.
Yeah. John, one of the executive orders that Trump signed yesterday related to all public servants have to return to the office 5 days a week. You noted that we've had employment growth in Australia. In fact, all that employment growth is really in the public sector. Do you think there should be a similar kind of rule imposed in Australia and get people back into the office and fill the offices again?
Well, if you look at the facts, Australia's productivity is declined as we've had this work from home ability negotiation. So if the two are linked, then working from home does not drive productivity. I was listening to a podcast interview with Noel Ferguson recently, and he made the point there's abundant evidence that working from home has exposed a lot of workers to an observation that they weren't doing much, even when they were in the office. So I think, and I find that, yes, there are some people say, look, I love working from home, and I think there are family issues, particularly with young children. And that's got to be considered. But, middle-aged workers who want to be paid based on being more productive, I think, and being happier. The workplace environment, we've done a lot through society to make the workplace safer and happier. And yet we then fall back to this position where I don't want to work in the workplace. So you can't have it every way. So I am, I'm on the side of supporting back to work, back to the office. And it has knock-on effects, I think in terms of mental health and benefits to society. So, yes, it does challenge governments because they've got to improve their infrastructure, their public transport, getting people to and from home. It's good to see that New South Wales, in particular, is improving its public transport system through its railways. So, we've met a challenge, and that challenge has to be maintained. Otherwise, if people are working from home, what are we spending all this money for on infrastructure?
John, what we do know is that growth and investment requires confidence. The figures in Australia in recent months indicate that confidence amongst business and households are at pretty low levels. And with the election coming up in May, we don't have a date yet, but it has to be by the end of May. Do you think we're going to go through a bit of a slow spot? And how does the market react to that? Are you worried about where valuations are, or do you think that they are kind of within the reasonableness range?
Well, it's a big question, Paul. I always watch the bond market, and I suspect there'll be bond market management, so yield management, which supports the equity market at this elevated level. That's where I sit now. If the bond market moves away from being managed by the central banks, particularly the American Central Bank, well, then we can look at the challenge that makes in terms of valuations. In terms of the election, what we're going to be confronted with both sides is let's say Trump moves aggressively on taxation changes and lowering the corporate tax rate, then that's a challenge to Australian politicians and Australian government about what we do with our tax rates. Now, if America adjusts aggressively its corporate tax rates, then we'll surely have to follow. And it'd be good if we did follow, and particularly for companies who want to set up in Australia and export to Asia, or companies who want to make Australia their head office in Asia. We should be supporting that, and the taxation policy of Australia is one way we can support it. And the taxation policy doesn't have to be black and white. Companies which can say to the Australian people, look, we want to start in Australia, we want to make this our head office for Asia, we want to employ Australians, we want to support economic growth and trade in Australia. Well, common sense tells you support that, and give them benefits which may not be given to other companies which don't have that focus. So I'm all for proactive management of the taxation policy and the stimulation of the Australian economy. And let's get going, and let's not import 1 million people into Australia to work services. Let's import 1 million people into Australia who are going to support economic growth and trade.
Clearly, a lot of what happens in Australia over the course of this year is going to depend on, the political ripples from Trump going across the world, and also the economic ripples coming from China. I think we'll have to leave it there, John, unless there's any last points you'd like to make. I suppose we should note that we've discussed bond yields quite a few times, and they seem to have come back from the brink after, rising from the high threes in both the United States and America. A couple of months ago, they pushed up to closing on 5%, but now they've dropped back to kind of the mid fours. Is that where you see them kind of stabilizing, John? And is the market happy or comfortable with long bond rates at around 4.5?
Well, the bond market will be comfortable so long as it sees support from Federal Reserves and central banks in managing the yield curve. Let's get realistic. There's an incredible supply of bonds in the world market, and there's a significant rollover of bonds each year that were set at lower interest rates being rolled into higher interest rates, which is going to feed into interest, which is going to feed into an expense going through government budgets, no more so than America. So we're not out of the woodwork. To answer your question specifically, I think the world capital markets, bond markets, could live with a US bond at 4.5%. It certainly couldn't live with a US bond above 5%. Now, at the other end of the yield curve, I think we will see more interest rate cuts, obviously cash rate cuts in the American market. Australia, obviously, we're scratching our heads trying to work out what to do with inflation and poor productivity and wage claims going through the system, and a very weak Australian dollar. So Australia is sort of caught, and the Reserve Bank doesn't know what it's playing to because there is no plan.
Last question, and we'll finish here. Are you expecting the RBA to cut in February?
No. But don't hang me if I'm wrong. I mean, you could not possibly cut with employment growth going through, the Aussie dollar so weak. So I think it's just status quo. Let America cut a few more times, see if that helps the Australian dollar, push up. I fear it won't, but I think we need to stay. And an interest rate cut now would be highly political, I think. But who knows what goes on into...
Interesting things have happened, yeah.
Exactly.
All right, thanks, John. That's all for this week, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fine.